An icy wind swept through the battlements of Bletsoe Castle on a bleak night in 1457. Suddenly, a piercing cry split the silence, not from the storm outside, but from within the stone walls. In a dim chamber lit by the faint glow of wavering candles, a girl no older than 13 clutched at blood-soaked sheets, her body twisted in torment, racked by pains far too great for one so young. The women attending her murmured desperate prayers in Latin, their shadows stretching across the cold walls as the fire guttered low. That girl was Lady Margaret Beaufort. Barely out of childhood, she was enduring the agonies of childbirth. Her hair, dark and matted with sweat, clung to her pale cheeks as each contraction threatened to break her fragile frame. The midwives feared she would not survive the night. Her hips were too narrow, her body still unformed. And yet, she labored on, forced to deliver a child destined for greatness. From her suffering would come Henry Tudor, the boy who would grow to claim England's crown and bring an end to the Wars of the Roses. A dynasty born in blood and anguish, the Tudors, who would alter the course of England and Europe forever. Before we journey deeper into Margaret's extraordinary story, if you find yourself captivated by the hidden truths of history, I invite you to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. It's remarkable that across centuries and from every corner of the globe, we can uncover these forgotten voices together, bound by our shared fascination with the past.
Margaret was no ordinary child. In her veins flowed the royal blood of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III. Yet in a world ruled by ambition and treachery, noble blood could make you powerful, or mark you as prey. From her earliest days, her fate was shaped not by her own will, but by the relentless currents of politics and war. Born in 1443, the daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she entered a world where marriage was not love but weapon, where a girl's future was bartered for crowns, castles, and influence. It was this cruel game of power that led Margaret, still a child herself, toward that candlelit chamber and the night that nearly claimed her life. Her father was gone before she could even form memories of him. Barely past her first birthday, Margaret lost John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, to what many claimed was his own despair. Defeat in France had hollowed him out. Some swore he took his own life, unable to bear the humiliation. Others muttered of poison, because in those years, any sudden death of a nobleman birthed whispers of hidden hands and silent cups. Whatever the truth, his downfall left a shadow over Margaret's childhood. John Beaufort had once led English troops in the fading years of the 100 Years' War. He watched, powerless, as the victories of Henry V unraveled, strongholds falling one by one back into French hands. By the time he returned to England in 1444, his body was alive, but his spirit already ruined. Courtiers noticed his gaunt face, his restless tremor, and the vacant stares that lingered for hours. On May 27th of that year, he was discovered lifeless in his chamber at Wimborne Minster. The records claimed illness. Those who truly knew him suspected otherwise, whether poison, blade, or the slow rot of failure. John Beaufort left the world branded by defeat. His widow, Margaret Beauchamp, wasted no time shielding her daughter's future. She knew survival in 15th century England meant building alliances before enemies closed in. By the tender age of 6, young Margaret was already promised in marriage to John de la Pole, heir of the Duke of Suffolk. It was a pact that linked two powerful houses, seemingly indestructible. But in the brutal world of court politics, even the strongest bonds could crumble overnight. In 1450, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, was dragged down in disgrace. He had brokered Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou and overseen the surrender of Maine and Anjou back to France, terms that enraged nobles and commoners alike. His fall was swift, his death savage. Stripped from his ship on the Channel, cut down by enemies who saw his blood as justice. In an instant, Margaret's carefully arranged betrothal became nothing more than ink on forgotten parchment. He was dragged to the side of the ship, forced to his knees on the gunwale, and hacked at with a dull blade. It took several brutal swings before his head finally fell. From that moment onward, the Beaufort women understood that survival was not about honor, but about flexibility. Margaret's next marriage was arranged just as quickly, this time to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother of King Henry VI through his mother's controversial union with Owen Tudor. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts, their claim to noble status shaky, but what they lacked in ancient bloodlines, they compensated for with the king's personal support. Owen Tudor, once a minor courtier, had secretly married Catherine of Valois, the widowed queen of Henry V, sparking outrage among England's elite. That scandal produced two sons, Edmund and Jasper, whom Henry VI legitimized and raised to prominence. In 1455, when Margaret was scarcely 12 years old, she was wed to Edmund in a ceremony at Bletsoe Castle, the same halls she had run through as a child. The great chamber was dressed with banners recounting her Beaufort heritage, and in the chapel, beneath the cold stone effigy of her grandfather, she pledged vows she could hardly comprehend. Edmund was a grown man in his 20s, hardened by war and politics, while Margaret still wore the face of a child. The union was immediately consummated. In that age, no one spared thought for a girl's physical immaturity. Noble daughters were treated as vessels for heirs, not children in need of protection.
The wedding night left scars Margaret never spoke of. Yet her devotion in later life, her near-obsessive piety, hints at trauma too deep to erase. Within months, her small frame betrayed the changes of pregnancy, and hushed whispers followed her through the corridors. The older women watched with mixed dread and celebration, the chance of an heir against the risk of death in childbirth. Her mother, who had been 18 at Margaret's birth, looked on with anguish. At 12, turning 13, her daughter was being forced into a danger that claimed countless older, stronger women. Edmund would never meet the child he had planted. In the autumn of 1456, while campaigning in Wales against the Yorkists, he fell into enemy hands at Carmarthen Castle. The details of his end are blurred by the chaos of civil war. Some chronicles say he was seized during a sudden strike while his men were scattered across South Wales. Others whisper of betrayal by those closest to him. Whether he perished from the plague while imprisoned or was quietly executed by his captors is still debated. Blaming disease was the easiest explanation. Pestilence thrived in medieval prisons, and calling it a natural death allowed his enemies to avoid the stain of killing a royal kinsman. Chroniclers of the time quietly remarked on how unnaturally fast Edmund faded, and how suspicious it was that his captors barred physicians from reaching him. What is certain is this: by late autumn of 1456, Margaret Beaufort, barely 13, found herself a widow, expecting a child, isolated, and standing on the brink of a realm tearing itself apart. The tidings of Edmund's death reached her at Lamphy Palace in Pembrokeshire. She had been lodged there during his campaign in Wales. On a storm-drenched evening, a rider arrived, his horse foaming with exhaustion from the breakneck journey. Margaret was kneeling in the chapel, whispering prayers for her husband's safe return, when the echo of boots broke the silence. She did not need to hear the words. The look in the messenger's eyes told her her life had collapsed. Responsibility for the young widow fell to Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother. It was both an act of protection and political necessity. Within Margaret's frail frame grew the possible future of the Tudor claim, an heir whose birth could anchor the family's fragile royal standing. Jasper escorted her to his power base, Pembroke Castle, a fortress clinging to the Welsh cliffs above the roaring waters of Milford Haven. The Atlantic surf battered the rocks ceaselessly below, as if nature itself was testing the endurance of those inside. Reaching Pembroke was an ordeal almost as daunting as childbirth itself. Winter had reduced the tracks to frozen trenches of mud, strewn with fallen branches and blocked river crossings. Margaret was carried in a litter, each jarring bump sending spasms through her weakened body. The two-day ride stretched into nearly a week, as escorts detoured around flooded fords and steered clear of armed bands, whose allegiance could not be trusted. Pembroke Castle in the depths of winter was less a sanctuary than a stone bastion of survival. Rising from a limestone promontory, its massive circular keep, nearly 80 feet tall, had endured centuries of siege and storm. Yet inside, luxury was absent. Drafts crept through the arrow slits, and the grand fireplaces roared hungrily, consuming timber faster than servants could haul it in. Here, in this bleak stronghold, Margaret prepared to endure the most perilous trial of her life. Margaret's chambers were lined with heavy wall hangings, desperate attempts to hold back the gales that cut through Pembroke's stone like knives. The winter of 1456
into 1457 was among the cruelest anyone could remember. Frost etched itself onto the inner panes, and the salt wind from the sea screamed endlessly through every fissure of the fortress walls. Margaret, her body swollen with pregnancy, could scarcely shuffle from her bed to the fire before collapsing in exhaustion. She was still little more than a child, and yet her frame bore the crushing weight of motherhood. The castle's physician, Master Lewis of Caerleon, a scholar seasoned by decades of study in Oxford, Paris, and the practice of both court and village, examined her with unease. In private counsel with Jasper Tudor, his voice was low and grave. Margaret's hips were narrow, the infant lay awkwardly, and the signs were ominous. He admitted that no accumulation of manuscripts, not Galen, not Hippocrates, not all the learned lectures he had sat through, could change the simple fact: this birth was perilous. Margaret herself had not finished growing, and the child inside her pressed dangerously against a body unready for delivery. In the castle's solar, with snow twisting through the arrow slits beyond, the physician spoke plainly. The choices were all dreadful. They might try to turn the infant by force, but such attempts often led to 2 corpses instead of 1. They could wait, hoping the child shifted naturally, though each passing day weakened both mother and babe. Or they could attempt the crude knife work of a caesarean, a sentence of certain death for the girl. Jasper Tudor, scarcely past 24, carried the weight of that judgment alone. If Margaret perished, the tenuous Tudor claim died with her. If the baby failed, the same doom followed. Yet it was not only dynastic ambition that pressed on him. Over those months he had come to respect the quiet courage of this girl, widowed before she was a woman, who endured her fate with a composure far beyond her years. As the harsh winter of 1456 dragged on, Margaret carried herself with a composure far beyond her 13 years. While her body weakened, her mind sharpened. Guided by Jasper Tudor, she began studying the realities of power, how to read expressions, how to recognize the lies buried in polite words, and how shifting alliances could make or break a dynasty. At the same time, she sought refuge in relentless prayer. Hours spent on her knees in the chapel left them raw and bleeding, but her faith became a weapon against fear, a way to give meaning to suffering she could not escape.
Father Meredith, the Welsh priest of Pembroke, deepened this devotion. Educated at Cambridge yet hardened by life, he reminded her that prayer alone was not enough, that God worked through human hands, and faith must be joined with action. It was a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life. Then, in January of 1457, the first contraction seized her as she walked the battlements for exercise. The pain struck like a blade, doubling her over against the cold stone. Servants rushed her back to her chamber, where the midwives exchanged grim looks. They had seen this too often, a girl forced to bear a child before her body was ready. Inside the dimly lit room, the women prepared for a night of trial. Herbs smoldered, lavender and rosemary thickening the air. Dame Gwen, the most experienced midwife, examined the young mother, and her face hardened. The birth would be brutal. Tools lay ready, knives, hooks, relics, each a reminder of what might be required if fate turned cruel. For nearly a day, Margaret labored, her screams fading into hoarse gasps as exhaustion swallowed her strength. The midwives worked with bloodied hands, shifting her position, whispering prayers, and trying every remedy they knew. Beyond the door, Jasper Tudor paced the stone corridor, each echo of his boots a reminder that not just one life, but the very survival of the Lancastrian cause, hung in the balance. From the corridor, Jasper Tudor could hear every cry tearing through the oak door, each scream cutting him deeper than any blade. Servants rushed past carrying steaming water and bloodied linens, their faces pale with fear. In the chapel, Father Meredith prayed ceaselessly, knowing that the girl's life was slipping away with each passing hour. By dawn, Margaret had labored almost a full day. Her pulse weakened, her skin turned ghostly pale, and her strength was nearly gone. The physician leaned close to Dame Gwen, his words urgent. The child still clung to life, but barely. There was no choice. With grim resolve, the midwife prepared for a desperate extraction, murmuring a prayer to St. Margaret of Antioch before reaching in to guide the infant. The chamber fell silent as the baby slid into the world, limp and bloodied. For one dreadful moment, only the crackle of the hearth could be heard. Then, with a sharp cry, the child's voice pierced the stillness, the first breath of Henry Tudor, future King of England. Margaret, drifting on the edge of consciousness, forced her eyes open. Through the blur of exhaustion, she saw the bundle placed briefly on her chest. Too weak to move her arms, she memorized the shape of her son's tiny face before the midwives carried him away to be swaddled by the fire.
The cost of that birth was written on her body, torn, broken, and scarred beyond repair. The young mother would never safely bear another child. At only 13, her womb was spent, her future as a woman reduced to a single heir, bought with agony. For weeks she lingered near death, fevered and shivering, while whispers echoed in the stone halls. Margaret Beaufort had survived, but at a price that would mark her for the rest of her life. The castle physician tried everything in his book: bleeding to calm the humours, bitter herbs against infection, and spiced wine to keep her fading body alive. Dame Gwen never left her side, feeding her broth drop by drop and watching for the slightest change in her pulse. But the deeper wounds were in Margaret's mind. Nightmares tore her from sleep, her screams echoing through the stone halls. She recoiled from touch, even from the attendants who cared for her. Holding her son was bittersweet. She adored him, yet his very presence reminded her of the agony that had nearly killed her. And yet, beneath the frailty, a steel resolve began to surface. By spring she was still weak, but her mind was sharper than ever. Margaret understood what few around her did. Her newborn was not just a child, but the fragile hope of the Lancastrian cause. Without him, her line ended. With him, she might shape the fate of England. The kingdom around her was unravelling. The roses of York and Lancaster had already drawn blood, and it was clear that swords would decide who ruled, not parchment or diplomacy. Richard, Duke of York, pressed his claim through Edward III's second son. The Lancastrians held theirs through John of Gaunt, the fourth. Margaret, descended from that bloodline, was now bound to a cause slipping dangerously toward defeat. A widowed girl of 13, body broken but spirit unyielding, she began the slow transformation into the formidable woman history would one day call Lady Margaret Beaufort. Henry VI was fragile, plagued by bouts of madness, and incapable of steady rule. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, was shrewder but despised, seen as the foreign hand dragging England into chaos. In this storm, Lady Margaret Beaufort was pushed into yet another marriage. By 1458, barely healed from her near-fatal childbirth, she wed Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The ceremony was modest, with none of the grandeur of her union to Edmund Tudor. Margaret was still mourning, still weak, but politics rarely paused for grief. Stafford was no great love match. He was chosen for survival. A Yorkist sympathizer, but, above all, a pragmatist, he knew that protecting Margaret meant safeguarding her estates and her royal bloodline. The contract reflected this cold reality. Margaret retained authority over her Beaufort inheritance, securing her son's future. Stafford offered his protection and political cover. Crucially, young Henry remained under Jasper Tudor's guardianship in Wales, a clause that almost certainly kept him alive. Their marriage endured for 14 turbulent years, through the carnage of the Wars of the Roses. Margaret witnessed the dizzying swings of fortune: Henry VI dethroned, Edward IV crowned, Henry restored, and Edward triumphant once more. Each turn of the wheel threatened her family. Survival demanded sharp instincts, and Margaret proved a quick study. She built quiet alliances where swords could not reach. With careful diplomacy, she maintained correspondence with Elizabeth Woodville, Queen to Edward IV, while secretly keeping ties to the exiled Margaret of Anjou. A single careless phrase could have branded her a traitor, yet she balanced on the knife's edge with remarkable skill. Through it all, her son grew up apart from her, raised in Jasper's Welsh fortress. She saw him only rarely, sometimes just once a year. Henry became a man shaped by distance, while his mother schemed in the shadows of English politics, driven by a singular purpose: to protect the boy who would one day decide England's fate. Margaret, unable to raise her son herself, funneled her maternal longing into letters and carefully coded notes, gifts of books or clothing when the channels allowed. But most days she lived in gnawing uncertainty, never sure if Henry was well, or even still alive. Jasper Tudor made sure the boy's education went beyond courtly polish. Henry learned swordplay and music, yes, but also the harsher lessons of loyalty and survival. He spoke Welsh, moved easily among common farmers, and inspired respect from men who owed him no blood tie. Those skills, forged in exile, would one day steady him on the path to kingship. Margaret herself was transforming. Through her marriage to Henry Stafford, she mastered estate management, law, and the mechanics of medieval politics. Her library became one of the richest private collections in England, brimming with texts on theology, history, and even military theory. Then came 1461. On a snow-covered field at Towton, Palm Sunday ran red with blood. By nightfall, tens of thousands lay dead, and the Lancastrian cause was shattered. Henry VI fled north. His queen and young heir escaped to France, and Edward IV secured the crown. For Margaret, this meant fresh peril. Her son in Wales was no longer just an heir. He was a threat. Edward had already executed rivals. Would he extend his reach to a boy barely out of the cradle? Haunted by the thought, she spun her own intelligence web, bribing clerks, paying servants, listening to whispers carried by merchants. That vigilance was costly, but it kept Henry alive. In 1469, Stafford was badly wounded at Edgecote while fighting for Edward IV. Infection left him lame and embittered, convinced he had risked everything for too little reward. Margaret, tending to his recovery, seized the chance. She never openly urged rebellion. That would have been suicide. Instead, she let doubt grow. She reminded him of the king's ingratitude, the corruption of Yorkist allies, the meager thanks given to loyal men. Slowly, she turned his disappointment into disaffection. By 1470, when Warwick the Kingmaker rose against Edward IV, Henry Stafford was no longer a steadfast Yorkist. He was ready to listen, and Margaret had ensured it. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man history nicknamed the Kingmaker, turned against the very king he had crowned. Once Edward IV's greatest ally, Warwick now joined forces with Margaret of Anjou in a strange, uneasy alliance to restore the half-mad Henry VI. Pride and revenge outweighed loyalty, and Margaret Beaufort followed these developments with quiet intensity. If Lancaster could rise again, then her son's future might finally be secured. In October 1470, the impossible happened. Henry VI was led from the Tower and restored to the throne. Edward fled into exile, while his bewildered predecessor stumbled back into royal robes he no longer seemed able to wear. Margaret attended the ceremony at Westminster, seeing firsthand how fragile and confused the king had become. But she also understood what it meant. Hope flickered again for the Lancastrians. That hope didn't last. Edward returned from Burgundy in early 1471 with hardened troops and momentum at his back. At Barnet, Warwick was cut down. Weeks later at Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian heir, young Edward of Westminster, was killed, either in the battle itself or cut down after capture. Soon after, Henry VI mysteriously vanished into the Tower for the last time. With the direct Lancastrian line extinguished, Margaret's son Henry became something far more dangerous, a living alternative. His claim was distant, complicated, but in a kingdom desperate for a rallying figure, he suddenly mattered. That made him a target. Jasper Tudor, understanding the peril, resolved to spirit the boy away before Yorkist blades could find him. On a storm-racked night in September 1471, 14-year-old Henry Tudor was rushed aboard a ship at Tenby. Within hours, he was gone, sailing toward exile in Brittany that would last 14 long years. Margaret wasn't there to hold him, wasn't even warned until the deed was done. By the time word reached her, mother and son were separated not just by the length of Wales, but by the English Channel and the uncertainty of war. For Margaret, the news was devastating. She had endured years of separation before, But now the distance was immeasurable. Standing in her mind's eye on the wind-swept cliffs of Pembrokeshire, she could only imagine her boy disappearing into the black waters of the Channel and wonder if she would ever see him again. Widowed again when Henry Stafford died in 1471, Margaret found herself free to act more openly. Whispers surrounded his death, illness, stress, perhaps darker causes, but for Margaret it meant opportunity. Now almost 30, she faced a choice: retreat into obscurity with a safe husband, or gamble everything on power. She chose the latter. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley, one of the shrewdest survivors of the Wars of the Roses. Stanley had perfected the art of political timing, switching allegiances only when the outcome was certain. His influence stretched across northern England, his retainers numbered in the thousands, and his information network reached into every chamber of court. For Margaret, this was the partner she needed. For Stanley, the marriage offered the prestige of Beaufort blood and proximity to royal ambition. The wedding was staged as a declaration. Margaret Beaufort remained a figure to be reckoned with. Nobles gathered for 3 days of tournaments, feasts and sermons. Even Edward IV attended, preferring to keep a dangerous woman under his gaze rather than plotting in the shadows. The terms were carefully crafted. Margaret retained control of her estates and freedom to pursue her son's interests, while Stanley gained a politically astute wife whose connections and determination matched his own. Their union was no romance, but a partnership of mutual advantage. Margaret used Stanley's cover to weave new alliances, gather intelligence, and keep her son's name alive among exiles and sympathizers. Stanley, ever the pragmatist, expanded his own power base while shielding her maneuvers. Together, they survived court intrigues and purges that destroyed families less cautious. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Henry Tudor grew into manhood under Duke Francis II of Brittany. His life was precarious, shaped by foreign politics and the constant question of whether England's enemies might one day see him as a useful weapon. Henry Tudor's years in Brittany were a gamble with fate. He was both a bargaining chip and a potential king, too valuable to ignore, too dangerous to leave unguarded. Margaret's only contact came through letters, written in invisible inks and disguised as mundane trade notes. They were slow, fragile lifelines, but they kept alive the bond between mother and son. Every silence gnawed at her. Had Henry fallen to illness, or had Yorkist assassins already struck? To survive, she built one of the most effective intelligence webs of her age. Merchants, priests, even servants whispering secrets across borders. News reached her faster than to some generals, giving her the edge she needed. When Edward IV died in April 1483, his 12-year-old heir never reached the crown. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized the throne, and the princes in the Tower vanished. Richard III's reign began in blood and suspicion. For Margaret, it was both peril and possibility. Suddenly, her son's tenuous claim looked like a banner of legitimacy against a king accused of murdering children. She moved with audacity. Through Bishop John Morton and other exiles, she coordinated conspiracies at home and abroad. Plans were drawn for Henry to land from Brittany, while risings ignited across England. The rebellion of 1483 failed, betrayal scattering her allies and sending men to the gallows. Margaret herself escaped death only through her marriage to Thomas Stanley, though she was stripped of titles and confined to house arrest. Yet even under guard she continued to plot, her resolve unbroken. 2 years later, her patience bore fruit. In August 1485, Henry landed at Milford Haven. At Bosworth Field, the Stanleys, swayed by Margaret's years of persuasion, turned against Richard at the decisive moment. The usurper fell in the mud, and Margaret's son was crowned Henry VII. After decades of separation, exile, and secrecy, her gamble had paid off. But the victory was bittersweet. Though she secured the throne for her son, the simple intimacy of motherhood had long since been lost to politics. She became the power behind the throne, shaping the new Tudor dynasty, arranging the marriage to Elizabeth of York, and ensuring England's fragile peace. When she died in 1509, just days after Henry VIII's coronation, she left behind more than wealth or estates. She left a dynasty born from sacrifice. From the screams of a 13-year-old girl in a freezing Welsh castle to the black marble of Westminster Abbey, Margaret Beaufort's life was a story of endurance turned into power. Her body was broken to give England a king. Her youth was stolen to secure a dynasty, and her will reshaped the fate of a nation.